There is a truth about your life that most people will spend their entire existence running from, hiding from, distracting themselves from, and numbing themselves against. And the reason your life feels heavier than it should, the reason your mind feels restless even when everything around you is quiet, the reason you keep searching for motivation, for peace, for confidence, for certainty, is because deep down, you already know this truth, but you have not yet had the courage to face it. And once you hear it clearly, once it lands in your chest and not just in your ears, your life will never feel the same again. If you are drawn to content like this, a content that sharpens your mind, strengthens your discipline, and helps you become emotionally untouchable in a chaotic world, then consider subscribing to this channel, because here we do not chase comfort, we build character, we build self-mastery, and we build an unbreakable mind. Now take a breath and listen carefully, because this is not just another motivational message, and this is not something designed to make you feel good for 5 minutes and then forget by tomorrow. This is confrontation. This is clarity. This is the moment where illusion ends and truth begins. The uncomfortable truth is this: nobody is coming to save you. Not your friends, not your family, not society, not luck, not timing, not some perfect opportunity. Not the version of life you keep imagining will suddenly arrive and fix everything that feels broken inside you. The life you want will not be handed to you because you suffered enough. Peace will not come because you meant well. Strength will not appear because you are tired of being weak. And respect will not come because you secretly know your worth. The world does not reward hidden potential. It rewards visible discipline. It rewards consistency. It rewards emotional control. It rewards those who can carry the weight without collapsing beneath it. And I know that truth hurts, because part of you still wants to believe that one day things will simply change. One day you'll wake up with more confidence. One day you'll suddenly become more focused. One day you'll finally stop procrastinating. One day your fear will disappear. One day your pain will make sense. One day people will understand you. One day life will become fair. But one day is a dangerous drug. One day has buried more dreams than failure ever did. And if you're honest, truly honest, maybe the hardest part of your life right now is not your circumstances. Maybe it is not your environment. Maybe it is not the people around you. Maybe the hardest part is admitting that you have been waiting instead of becoming. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting to feel inspired. Waiting to feel chosen. Waiting to feel less afraid. But the Stoics understood something that modern people hate to hear: readiness is a myth. You do not become ready and then act. You act, and through action you become ready. That is the first uncomfortable truth. The second is even heavier. Most of your suffering does not come from life itself. It comes from your resistance to life. Read that again in your spirit. Most of your suffering does not come from what happened to you. It comes from your war with what happened. It comes from replaying the past. It comes from wishing reality were different. It comes from demanding that life obey your preferences. It comes from expecting people to be who they are not. It comes from wanting certainty in a world built on change. You are not exhausted only because life is hard. You are exhausted because your mind is constantly arguing with reality. And that war will drain you faster than any hardship ever could. Stoicism does not teach you to pretend pain is not real. It teaches you not to multiply it. It teaches you not to turn one wound into 10 by feeding it with endless interpretation. It teaches you to see clearly, to say, "This happened. I do not like it, but it happened. Now what is required of me?" That question changes everything. Not why me, not when will it stop, not who should I blame, but what is required of me now? Because that is where power begins. And most people never find power because they are too busy trying to find comfort. But comfort is often the very thing destroying you. That is another uncomfortable truth nobody wants to accept. The same comfort you crave is often the prison you live in. The extra sleep that weakens your discipline. The endless scrolling that numbs your ambition. The distractions that protect you from facing your emptiness. The toxic relationships that feel familiar. The excuses that sound gentle but quietly kill your future. The habits you keep because they help you avoid yourself. You say you want peace, but sometimes what you really want is sedation. You say you want freedom, but sometimes what you really want is relief. And relief is not the same as healing. This is where your transformation begins. Not when you feel inspired, but when you stop lying to yourself. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really answer it in your mind. What in your life right now are you pretending not to know? What truth have you been avoiding because facing it would require change? Is it that you are wasting time? Is it that you are too attached to people who do not value you? Is it that you are waiting for permission to become who you already know you need to become? Is it that your discipline is weaker than your desires? Is it that your standards are too low? Is it that your pain has become your identity? Is it that your fear of discomfort is costing you your future? Because the truth you avoid does not disappear. It waits. And the longer you avoid it, the more expensive it becomes. That is how life works. Avoid the conversation and lose the relationship. Avoid the discipline and lose your potential. Avoid the hard truth and lose years. Avoid responsibility and lose yourself. Nothing destroys a human being faster than prolonged self-betrayal. That is a sentence you need to remember. Nothing destroys a human being faster than prolonged self-betrayal. Not failure, not rejection, not heartbreak, not criticism. Self-betrayal, knowing what you must do and not doing it. Knowing who you need to become and refusing to become them. Knowing what is poisoning your peace and continuing to consume it anyway. That is the deepest form of suffering because it creates a split inside you. One part of you knows the truth. Another part keeps negotiating with weakness. And that internal conflict becomes anxiety, frustration, shame, confusion, envy, emotional exhaustion. You do not always need more information. Sometimes you need more honesty. And honesty is not always soft. Sometimes honesty is brutal. Sometimes honesty says, you are the reason your life has not changed. Not entirely. Not in every way. Not for every pain you carry. Life is complex. Some wounds were handed to you unfairly. Some battles were never your choice. Some scars were not your fault. But healing them is your responsibility. And that is the distinction mature people understand. You may not be responsible for the storm, but you are responsible for how long you stay in the wreckage. This is the Stoic path. It is not glamorous. It is not easy. It is not always emotionally satisfying, but it is real. It says, I will not waste my life complaining about what I cannot control. It says, I will not surrender my peace to people who have not mastered themselves. It says, I will not let temporary emotions make permanent decisions for me. It says, I will become someone I can respect in private. That last one matters more than most people realize. Because one of the most uncomfortable truths of adulthood is that public image means almost nothing if private character is weak. A person can look powerful and still be fragile. A person can look successful and still be empty. A person can speak confidently and still be ruled by fear. A person can have followers and still not have self-respect. And if you build your life around appearance instead of substance, life will eventually expose you. It always does. So the real question is not, how do I look to others? The real question is, who am I when no one is watching? Who are you when there is no applause? Who are you when no one checks on you? Who are you when life becomes repetitive? Who are you when discipline is boring? Who are you when the results are delayed? Who are you when the loneliness hits? Who are you when your excuses sound reasonable? That is your real self. And if that answer makes you uncomfortable, good. Because discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that truth has entered the room. Most people avoid discomfort because they associate it with danger. But the Stoic sees discomfort differently. The Stoic understands that discomfort is often the furnace where identity is reforged. You do not become strong by talking about strength. You become strong by enduring what weaker versions of you would have escaped. You do not become confident by waiting to feel certain. You become confident by surviving what you thought would break you. You do not become peaceful by controlling the world. You become peaceful by controlling your response to the world. And that is why your suffering, if approached correctly, can become sacred. Not because pain is beautiful, not because hardship is romantic, but because pain reveals. It reveals what you worship. It reveals what controls you. It reveals where your ego is fragile. It reveals where your attachments are unhealthy. It reveals whether your values are real or just convenient ideas you repeat when life is easy. Anyone can talk about inner peace when life is comfortable. But can you remain steady when you are misunderstood? Can you remain disciplined when no reward is immediate? Can you remain composed when emotions surge through your body like fire? Can you remain principled when compromise would be easier? Can you remain silent when your ego wants revenge? Can you remain focused when your mind wants escape? That is where the real work begins. And this is the uncomfortable truth most people never accept until life forces it upon them. Your mind must become stronger than your moods. If your moods control your actions, your life will always be unstable. One bad morning and you lose your routine. One emotional wound and you lose your direction. One rejection and you lose your confidence. One difficult season and you lose your belief in yourself. That is not power. That is emotional dependency. And Stoicism is, in many ways, the art of becoming less emotionally dependent on external conditions. Not numb, not cold, not robotic, just no longer enslaved. There is a difference. A Stoic still feels pain. A Stoic still feels grief. A Stoic still feels loneliness. A Stoic still feels disappointment. But they do not kneel before those feelings. They observe them. They endure them. They learn from them. And then they continue. That is strength. Not the absence of emotion, but the refusal to be ruled by it. If you can understand that deeply, your life begins to change. Because suddenly, every hard moment becomes training. Every delay becomes training. Every insult becomes training. Every temptation becomes training. Every disappointment becomes training. Every lonely night becomes training. Every urge to quit becomes training. And now life is no longer just happening to you. It is shaping you. This is why weak people curse adversity. But wise people study it. They ask, what is this moment trying to teach me? And I want you to think about that right now. What has your current pain been trying to teach you that your comfort never could? Maybe it is teaching you detachment. Maybe it is teaching you patience. Maybe it is teaching you self-respect. Maybe it is teaching you not to chase people. Maybe it is teaching you to stop depending on external validation. Maybe it is teaching you to build a life so rooted within yourself that chaos outside of you loses its authority. Because that is the real victory. Not controlling the world, but becoming unshaken by it. And if that sounds difficult, it is. But so is living the opposite way. It is hard to be disciplined. And it is hard to hate your life. It is hard to face the truth. And it is hard to keep running from it. It is hard to let go. And it is hard to stay attached to what keeps hurting you. Choose your heart. That is one of the most mature decisions a person can make. Choose the pain that builds you instead of the pain that drains you. Choose the loneliness of growth over the crowd of self-abandonment. Choose the discipline of self-respect over the comfort of regret. Choose the temporary discomfort of change over the permanent disappointment of staying the same. Because here is another uncomfortable truth. Your future is being built by what you repeat in private. Not what you say once. Not what you feel strongly about occasionally. Not what you promise yourself at night. What you repeat. Your routines are your destiny in disguise. And if your daily habits are not aligned with the person you claim you want to become, then your desires are fantasy, not intention. That may sound harsh, but it is liberating, because it means your life is not changed by luck. It is changed by structure. That means you do not need to wait for a miracle. You need a system. You need self-command. You need standards. You need a mind that can say no to what weakens you and yes to what strengthens you. And that is rare now, because modern life is designed to make you soft. Everything is instant. Everything is stimulating. Everything is engineered to keep you distracted. dependent, reactive, impulsive, emotionally fragile, and mentally scattered. You are living in a world that profits from your lack of discipline. So if you feel weak sometimes, understand this. It is not accidental. You are being pulled in 1,000 directions every day by systems that benefit from your confusion. But once you see that clearly, you also lose the right to remain passive. Because now you know, and once you know, responsibility begins. This is why self-mastery today is almost an act of rebellion. To wake up early when comfort says sleep. To stay silent when ego says react. To remain calm when chaos invites panic. To stay focused when distraction is everywhere. To remain moral when compromise is profitable. To keep your word when no one would know if you broke it. That is rebellion. That is power. That is what makes a person dangerous in the best possible way. Not because they seek to dominate others, but because they can no longer be easily controlled. And maybe that is the version of you life has been trying to create all along. Not a more comfortable you. Not a more approved of you. Not a more entertained you. A stronger you. Clearer you. Calmer you. A more disciplined you. A less needy you. A less reactive you. A more sovereign you. But that version of you requires death. Not physical death. Ego death. Excuse death. Illusion death. Dependency death. The death of the version of you that keeps asking life to be easier instead of asking yourself to be stronger. And yes, that death hurts. Because you cannot become who you need to be while remaining attached to who you have been. That is the price. Growth is not addition. Growth is subtraction. You do not just gain discipline. You lose indulgence. You do not just gain peace. You lose chaos. You do not just gain self-respect. You lose the version of you that tolerated less than you deserved. And many people say they want transformation until they realize transformation requires grief. You must grieve your old identity. You must grieve the years you wasted. You must grieve the patterns that once comforted you. You must grieve the fantasy that life was supposed to be easier. But grief is not the end. It is the doorway, because once the false self begins to fall apart, something stronger can finally be built. And if you are listening to this right now at a low point in your life, if you feel tired, confused, isolated, behind, emotionally heavy, mentally scattered, spiritually disconnected, hear this clearly. This may be the season where your illusions are dying. And that is not always a curse. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to your comfort is the best thing that can happen to your character. Sometimes losing what distracted you is what introduces you to yourself. Sometimes being forced into solitude is what saves you from a life of noise. Sometimes disappointment is the final push that makes you stop begging life for scraps and start building something real. So no, this is not the end of you, but it may need to become the end of your excuses. The uncomfortable truth is that most people do not fail because they are incapable. They fail because they never truly decide. They flirt with change. They talk about growth. They admire discipline from a distance. They save motivational videos, repeat powerful quotes, imagine a better life in private, and promise themselves that tomorrow will be different. But when the moment comes to cut off what weakens them, to wake up earlier, to stay consistent, to endure boredom, to confront themselves honestly, to choose long-term dignity over short-term pleasure, they hesitate. And in that hesitation, their future slips quietly through their hands. That is how most lives are lost. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in tiny betrayals repeated so often they become personality. And if you want to understand why so many people never change, you have to stop looking only at what they say they want and start looking at what they are unwilling to sacrifice. Because that is where the truth lives. Everyone says they want peace until peace demands detachment. Everyone says they want discipline until discipline demands discomfort. Everyone says they want greatness until greatness demands isolation, patience, and the death of childish habits. People love the idea of becoming powerful, but they hate the funeral required to get there. That is why so many remain the same. Because change is not cute. Change is violent, not outwardly, inwardly. Tears through your identity, confronts your excuses. It strips away your fantasy self and forces you to stand naked before your own potential and your own laziness at the same time. And most people would rather stay familiar than be free. That is one of the darkest truths of human nature. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar growth. Read that slowly in your spirit. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar growth. That is why people stay in toxic relationships. That is why people stay trapped in low standards. That is why people stay addicted to distractions. That is why people stay weak even while claiming they want strength. Because weakness becomes predictable, and the mind, if left untrained, will often choose what is predictable over what is meaningful. That is why your mind cannot be blindly trusted. Not every thought deserves respect. Not every feeling deserves obedience. Not every urge deserves expression. Not every desire deserves action. And this is where Stoicism separates the mature from the impulsive. A weak mind says, I feel this, so I must follow it. A disciplined mind says, I feel this, but I will decide whether it deserves to lead me. That difference will determine your destiny. Because if you are ruled by every impulse, every emotional wave, every passing temptation, every moment of self-doubt, every craving for validation, every urge to quit, then your life will always belong to the loudest emotion in the room. And emotions are terrible leaders when they are undisciplined. This is why your first responsibility is not to control the world. It is to govern yourself, to govern your speech, to govern your appetite, to govern your reactions, to govern your attention, to govern your habits, to govern your inner world. Because if you cannot govern yourself, life will govern you brutally. And life does not teach softly forever. That is another uncomfortable truth. If you refuse to discipline yourself, life will do it for you through pain. If you refuse to learn patience, life will make you wait. If you refuse to learn detachment, life will remove what you cling to. If you refuse to learn self-respect, life will let people use you until you finally get tired of bleeding. If you refuse to master your mind, life will let your own thoughts become your prison. Life is not cruel for doing this. Life is exact. It reveals what remains unlearned. That is why your patterns matter so much. Not your intentions, your patterns. Because intentions are cheap. Patterns are proof. And if you are being honest, there may be a pattern in your life right now that keeps quietly sabotaging you. Maybe it is inconsistency. Maybe it is emotional dependency. Maybe it is laziness disguised as waiting for the right time. Maybe it is overthinking. Maybe it is people-pleasing. Maybe it is self-pity. Maybe it is avoidance. Maybe it is secretly enjoying the identity of being the one who almost changes but never fully does. That one is dangerous, because there is a strange comfort in unrealized potential. As long as you never fully commit, you never have to fully confront what you are capable of, or what you are not. As long as you keep saying, I could if I wanted to, you can protect your ego from reality. But reality does not care what you could have been. Reality only responds to what you repeatedly do. That is why the Stoic path is not built on fantasy. It is built on evidence. Evidence of character, evidence of restraint, evidence of courage, evidence of consistency, evidence that when your lower self whispers later, your higher self answers now. That is where your power is. Not in how inspired you feel after watching something like this, but in what you do when this video ends and silence returns. Because that is where most people lose themselves. They consume truth, but do not embody it. They listen to wisdom, but do not live it. They admire discipline, but do not practice it. And over time, they mistake emotional stimulation for transformation. But being moved is not the same as being changed. That is one of the most important truths you will ever hear. Being moved is not the same as being changed. A song can move you. A speech can move you. A quote can move you. A video can move you. But only repetition changes you. Only structure changes you. Only action changes you. Only daily confrontation with your lower nature changes you. That means if you truly want your life to become unrecognizable in the next year, Your focus should not be on finding more motivation. It should be on building a system that works even when motivation dies. Because motivation is a guest. Discipline is a resident. Motivation visits when the mood is right. Discipline stays when the room is cold, the body is tired, the reward is delayed, and nobody is watching. That is why disciplined people look calm. It is not because their lives are easy. It is because they are no longer negotiating with themselves every 5 minutes. Think about how much energy you waste every day in internal debate. Should I get up or stay in bed? Should I work or procrastinate? Should I speak or remain silent? Should I stay or finally leave? Should I train or skip? Should I start now or wait until tomorrow? A mind without standards is a battlefield. A mind with standards becomes a command center. And if you want peace, you need fewer negotiations with weakness. That means some decisions in your life need to become final. Not emotional. Final. Final that you will no longer beg to be chosen. Final that you will no longer betray your future for temporary pleasure. Final that you will no longer let your mood decide your behavior. Final that you will no longer explain your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. Final that you will no longer keep reopening doors that nearly destroyed your peace. Because one of the most uncomfortable truths about healing is this: some wounds stay open because you keep touching them. That line alone can change a life. Some wounds stay open because you keep touching them. You keep revisiting the memory. You keep checking their page. You keep replaying the betrayal. You keep reopening the conversation in your mind. You keep mentally returning to the thing that broke you and wondering why you are still bleeding. But healing requires a kind of ruthless mercy. You have to stop feeding what is killing you, even if part of you still misses it, even if part of you still loves it, even if part of you still hopes it will become something else. Hope, when misplaced, can become a prison. And the Stoic learns to separate hope from delusion. Hope says, I will continue to build what is mine to build. Delusion says, I will keep waiting for what has repeatedly shown me it cannot become what I need. That distinction can save years of your life. And many people waste their strongest years not because they are incapable of greatness, but because they are emotionally entangled with what keeps them weak. That is the truth. Some people are not just distracted. They are attached to their own dysfunction, attached to chaos, attached to drama, attached to emotional highs and lows, attached to being the victim, attached to being rescued, attached to being seen as misunderstood, rather than becoming disciplined enough to become undeniable. That is a dangerous attachment, because if you are secretly invested in the identity of being broken, then healing feels like losing yourself. And that is why some people sabotage every opportunity to become whole. Not because they do not want peace, but because peace would require them to become unfamiliar to themselves. An identity is powerful, which is why if you want to change your life, you cannot only change your habits. You must challenge your self-concept. You must stop asking, what should I do today? And start asking, who am I becoming every time I repeat this behavior? Because every action is a vote. Every action is a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. Every time you stay silent instead of reacting, vote. Every time you keep your word to yourself, vote. Every time you endure discomfort without escaping, vote. Every time you choose discipline over indulgence, vote. Every time you protect your peace instead of chasing noise, vote. And over time, identity is built, not in one grand moment, but in accumulated proof. That is why you do not need to feel like a powerful person before you act like one. You need to act like one until the evidence becomes undeniable. This is the Stoic way. Not, I'll do it when I feel ready, but I will become ready through repetition. And that matters because the modern world has made too many people emotionally soft. Too many people are addicted to feeling instead of building. Too many people want to be understood more than they want to be disciplined. Too many people are obsessed with expressing themselves but terrified of mastering themselves. And there is a huge difference. Expression without mastery becomes chaos. You do not need to say everything you feel. You do not need to react to every insult. You do not need to explain every boundary. You do not need to answer every provocation. You do not need to win every argument. You do not need to prove your intelligence to fools. One of the deepest signs of growth is learning that your energy is not free. Your peace is expensive. Your attention is expensive. Your life is expensive. And once you realize that, you stop spending yourself on things that produce no return. This is why the Stoic becomes selective. Selective with speech. Selective with people. Selective with environments. Selective with habits. Selective with what enters the mind. Because what enters the mind eventually shapes the life. And if your mind is constantly being fed noise, comparison, outrage, stimulation, vanity, and emotional clutter, then clarity becomes almost impossible. That is why silence is so powerful. Silence reveals. Silence exposes what distraction was hiding. Silence shows you what you are actually carrying. Silence forces you to meet the version of yourself you have been avoiding. And most people fear silence not because silence is empty, but because silence is honest. It strips away performance. It removes the crowd. It leaves you with yourself. And if you are not at peace with yourself, silence can feel unbearable. But that is exactly why you need it. Because the person who cannot sit alone with their own mind is not free. That person is dependent on noise for escape. And escape has become the modern religion. Scroll, watch, eat, text, chase, react, numb, repeat. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to hear the truth rising from within. But the truth does not disappear because you distract yourself. It waits. It waits in your exhaustion. It waits in your anxiety. It waits in your envy. It waits in your restlessness. It waits in the strange emptiness you feel even after getting what you thought you wanted. And eventually, if you do not choose truth voluntarily, suffering will force the conversation. That is why some people only awaken after loss, after heartbreak, after humiliation, after failure, after being abandoned, after hitting a wall so hard that all illusion collapses. And as painful as that is, sometimes it is mercy in disguise. Because sometimes the collapse is not punishment. Sometimes it is revelation. Sometimes life has to break the false structure so the real one can finally be built. And if that is where you are right now, if parts of your life feel like they are falling apart, listen carefully. Do not rush to label every painful season as destruction. Some seasons are demolition before construction. Some seasons are separation before clarity. Some seasons are silence before direction. Some seasons are emptiness before identity. Some seasons are discomfort before alignment. And if you can stop panicking long enough to observe what this season is trying to teach you, you may discover that what felt like a setback was actually an invitation to become someone stronger than you have ever been. But strength has a cost. And here is another uncomfortable truth. You cannot become powerful while remaining addicted to comfort. You simply cannot. Comfort dulls edge. Comfort weakens urgency. Comfort seduces potential into sleep. This does not mean you must hate your life or romanticize suffering. That is not Stoicism. Stoicism is not self-punishment. It is self-command. It is choosing voluntary difficulty so involuntary difficulty does not destroy you. That is why cold mornings matter. That is why discipline matters. That is why saying no matters. That is why keeping promises to yourself matters. That is why restraint matters. Because every time you willingly choose discomfort in service of your higher self, you become less afraid of life. And that is priceless. A person who can endure discomfort becomes dangerous to mediocrity. Because now delay cannot break them. Now rejection cannot stop them. Now boredom cannot weaken them. Now loneliness cannot manipulate them. Now emotional storms cannot dominate them. Now they are becoming stable. And stability is rare. In a world full of emotional volatility, a stable mind is a superpower. To remain composed when others panic. To remain clear when others spiral. To remain principled when others compromise. To remain grounded when others seek applause. To remain disciplined when others chase pleasure. That is rare. That is valuable. That is the kind of energy people feel before you even speak. Because the strongest presence in any room is not always the loudest. It is often the person who needs the least, the one who does not need validation, the one who does not need attention, the one who does not need to win every exchange, the one who does not need to prove they matter. That person has become internally anchored. And internal anchoring is the beginning of freedom. Because once your center is within you, the world loses its power to constantly throw you off course. And that is what you should be building. Not a life that is easy, a self that is solid. Not a world with no pain, a mind with more command. Not a reality where nothing goes wrong, a character that can remain upright when it does. That is the uncomfortable truth. Life may never become as soft as your fantasies promised. People may not love you the way you deserve. The timing may not be ideal. The recognition may come late. The path may be lonely. The process may be longer than you hoped. But if you become strong enough, none of that will stop you. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the goal was never to create a life with no friction. Maybe the goal was to become the kind of person friction cannot destroy. That is the path. That is the work. That is the standard. And if you are still here listening, then some part of you is ready. Not ready because the fear is gone. Ready because you are finally tired of remaining the same. And that is enough to begin. The brutal truth about discipline is that it does not feel heroic when you are living it. It feels repetitive, feels lonely, feels invisible. It feels like doing the right thing over and over again while nobody claps, nobody notices, and sometimes not even you feel impressed by your own effort. That is why so few people build a life they respect. They are not destroyed by difficulty alone. They are destroyed by monotony. They can survive one painful moment, one intense burst of hardship, one emotional storm, but they cannot endure the quiet grind of becoming. They want transformation to feel cinematic, but most real transformation happens in silence, in repetition, in mornings that look almost identical, in days where nothing exciting happens except that you kept your word to yourself again. And that is not sexy, but it is sacred, because discipline is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in ordinary ones. The ordinary moment when you choose not to react. The ordinary moment when you get up anyway. The ordinary moment when you stop chasing what keeps wounding you. The ordinary moment when you return to your standards after a weekday. The ordinary moment when you close the app, put the phone down, and sit with your own mind instead of running from it. That is where your future is being shaped. And the uncomfortable truth is that your life is not determined by your biggest intentions. It is determined by your smallest repeated obediences. That is why your habits matter more than your emotions. Your emotions will change by the hour. Your habits will shape your years. And if your habits are weak, your life will become unstable no matter how deeply you want better. Wanting better is easy. Becoming better is mechanical. It is procedural. It is repetitive. It is often deeply unglamorous. And that is exactly why it works. Because greatness is rarely built by what is exciting. It is built by what is repeated. The gym when you do not feel like going. The silence when you want to explain yourself. The discipline when nobody would know if you failed. The prayer, the reading, the work, the stillness, the self-control, the refusal to indulge every urge your lower self throws at you. That is where the war is. And make no mistake, it is a war, not necessarily with other people, with yourself, with the part of you that wants ease over excellence, with the part of you that wants relief over responsibility, with the part of you that wants comfort now and regrets later, with the part of you that wants to be admired without being forged. That part of you is real, and if you do not confront it, it will quietly design your entire life. This is why Stoicism is not just a philosophy. It is self-defense. It protects you from becoming a servant to your own impulses. Because if you are not careful, your life can be hijacked by things that feel small in the moment but become catastrophic over time. A little laziness here, a little avoidance there, a little compromise, a little emotional indulgence, a little inconsistency, a little lying to yourself, a little lowering of standards, a little tolerance for what drains your peace, and slowly, almost invisibly, You wake up one day and realize you have become someone you do not even recognize. Not because you made one massive mistake, but because you kept ignoring small betrayals. That is how character erodes, quietly, and that is why rebuilding yourself requires intensity. Not panic, not drama, intensity. The kind of intensity that says, I am done playing with my own life. The kind of intensity that says, I refuse to die with potential still trapped inside me. The kind of intensity that says, I will not let my future be shaped by a weaker version of me. That intensity is necessary because life is always pulling you downward. Always. Toward ease, toward distraction, toward comfort, toward numbness, toward emotional indulgence, toward passivity. You do not drift upward into strength. You rise there deliberately, and that rising will cost you people. That is another truth many are not prepared for. The stronger you become, the lonelier certain seasons will feel, because growth changes your appetite. You stop craving the same conversations. You stop enjoying the same environments. You stop needing the same attention. You stop tolerating the same emotional chaos. You stop finding meaning in things that once consumed you. And when that shift happens, there is often a period where you feel strangely alone. Not because you are broken, but because your spirit has outgrown what your old self was still attached to. That loneliness can be painful, but it can also be holy, because loneliness is not always a punishment. Sometimes loneliness is the space required for reconstruction. Sometimes life has to isolate you so it can introduce you to yourself without interference. Sometimes the crowd has to disappear so you can hear your own convictions. Sometimes the noise has to die so your real standards can finally be born. And yes, in that season, you may question everything. You may question whether the discipline is worth it. You may question whether anyone understands you. You may question whether your silence is strength or simply distance. You may question whether becoming more self-contained means becoming cold. But hear this clearly. There is a difference between being cold and being composed. There is a difference between being detached and being dead inside. Stoicism is not emotional emptiness. It is emotional sovereignty. It is not refusing to feel. It is refusing to let every feeling own you. That distinction matters deeply, especially in a world where people either drown in emotion or numb themselves into dysfunction. Stoicism offers a third path, not chaos, not numbness, clarity, and clarity changes everything. Because once you see clearly, you stop wasting energy in places where no peace can grow. You stop begging for understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to force alignment where there is none. You stop expecting depth from shallow minds. You stop seeking nourishment from empty hands. And that is when your life becomes cleaner. Not easier, cleaner. Less noise, less confusion, less self-betrayal, less emotional leakage, less pretending, less chasing. And from that cleanliness, power begins to gather. This is why becoming untouchable is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming less available to what once controlled you, less available to disrespect, less available to temptation, less available to distraction, less available to manipulation, less available to your own lower impulses. That is real power, because once you become less available to what weakens you, your life begins to rise almost automatically. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy, but because you stop constantly sabotaging your own peace. And sabotage is more common than most people realize. Sometimes the enemy is not out there. Sometimes the enemy is the version of you that still finds comfort in dysfunction. The version of you that checks the message you should not check. The version of you that delays the work you know matters. The version of you that romanticizes the past even though the past was starving your spirit. The version of you that confuses being desired with being valued. The version of you that still hopes the same patterns will somehow produce a different outcome. That version must be outgrown. And outgrowing it requires mourning. Because one of the hardest parts of becoming disciplined is accepting that some versions of you can no longer come with you. The undisciplined version. The attention-hungry version. The approval-seeking version. The easily triggered version. the easily seduced version, the version that wanted to be carried instead of built. Some parts of you have to die, and not everyone is willing to grieve who they have been. That is why they stay trapped, because they want the next chapter without closing the previous one. But life does not work like that. You cannot become sovereign while still kneeling to the habits that keep you weak. You cannot become peaceful while still entertaining the patterns that breed chaos. You cannot become disciplined while still worshiping convenience. There must be a break. Clean break. And maybe that is what this season of your life is demanding. Not another temporary burst of motivation. A break. A real one. A decisive one. A moment where you stop saying, "I'm trying," and finally say, "I'm done." Done with excuses. Done with emotional dependency. Done with self-neglect. Done with wasting mornings. Done with pretending you do not know what needs to change. Because if we are honest, you probably already know. You probably already know what is draining you. You probably already know what needs to be cut off. You probably already know what habit is stealing your edge. You probably already know where your discipline collapses. You probably already know which truth you keep postponing. The issue is not always lack of clarity. Sometimes it is lack of courage. And courage does not always look dramatic. Sometimes courage looks like deleting the number. Sometimes courage looks like getting up at the first alarm. Sometimes courage looks like saying nothing. Sometimes courage looks like starting before you feel ready. Sometimes courage looks like disappointing the version of you that wanted to stay small. That last one is important, because there is a version of you that wants to remain weak. Not consciously perhaps, but comfortably distracted, comfortably average, comfortably uncommitted, comfortably emotionally unstable, comfortably working on it forever. And if you do not become ruthless with that version of yourself, you will spend years circling the same mountain while calling it progress. That is a painful truth. Movement is not always growth. Being busy is not always becoming. Thinking is not always evolving. Talking is not always transforming. Consuming is not always applying. And many people are addicted to the feeling of movement while remaining fundamentally unchanged. That is why silence, structure, and repetition are so important, because they expose whether you are actually changing or just entertaining yourself with the idea of change. And the Stoic path has no patience for self-deception. It asks direct questions. Can you do what is necessary without applause? Can you remain steady when misunderstood? Can you protect your peace when provoked? Can you endure discomfort without turning it into drama? Can you keep building when the results are invisible? Can you remain disciplined when life becomes boring? Because boredom is where most people reveal themselves. When life is intense, dramatic, urgent, emotional, almost anyone can feel alive. But when the day is plain, when the work is repetitive, when there is no immediate reward, when no one is validating your progress, when all you have is your standards and your word, who are you then? That is the real test. And if you can win there, you can win almost anywhere. Because a person who can stay committed in boring seasons becomes nearly unstoppable. They are no longer dependent on adrenaline. They are no longer addicted to chaos. They are no longer waiting for emotion to carry them. They have become self-led. And self-led people move differently. They do not need to announce everything. They do not need to explain every choice. They do not need everyone to understand the mission. They simply move, quietly, consistently, deliberately, and over time, that quiet consistency becomes intimidating to the undisciplined. Not because you are trying to prove anything, but because a person who governs themselves exposes everyone still ruled by impulse. That is why discipline can feel isolating. Your presence alone begins to challenge people who are comfortable in excuses. Your boundaries begin to offend people who benefited from your lack of them. Your calm begins to unsettle people who survive on chaos. Your standards begin to threaten people who need you weak to feel secure. And if you are not careful, you will interpret that friction as a sign that you are doing something wrong. But sometimes friction is confirmation. Sometimes resistance means you are finally no longer easy to control. That is a beautiful kind of loneliness. Painful, but beautiful. Because once you stop being easily controlled, your life changes forever. Now your moods cannot pull you around as easily. Now people's opinions do not pierce as deeply. Now temptations do not own you the way they used to. Now rejection no longer feels like annihilation. Now solitude no longer feels like punishment. Now you are beginning to stand on your own inner ground. And that is what becoming untouchable really means. Not that life cannot hurt you. It can. Not that betrayal cannot sting. It will. Not that grief cannot shake you. It can. But it no longer gets to define you. It no longer gets to rewrite your identity. It no longer gets to determine your standards. It no longer gets to become your excuse for self-destruction. That is the difference. Pain visits. It does not rule. And when you truly understand that, your relationship with hardship changes forever. You stop asking, how do I avoid pain? And you start asking, how do I become the kind of person pain cannot corrupt? That is a far more powerful question. Because corruption is the real danger. Not just suffering. Corruption. The corruption of your values. The corruption of your peace. The corruption of your discipline. The corruption of your character under pressure. Anyone can look composed when life is soft. But who are you when denied? Who are you when delayed? Who are you when disappointed? Who are you when nobody comes through? Who are you when your plans collapse and your ego has nowhere to hide? That is when your real architecture is revealed. And if your architecture is weak, do not despair. Rebuild. But rebuild honestly. Not with quotes. Not with fantasies. Not with temporary emotion. With standards. Standards that remain even when you are tired. Standards that remain even when you are lonely. Standards that remain even when you are tempted to settle. Standards that remain even when nobody would know if you lowered them. That is where dignity lives. And dignity is one of the most powerful things a human being can possess. Not image. Dignity. The kind of dignity that says, even in pain, I will not abandon myself. The kind of dignity that says, even in loneliness, I will not crawl back to what dishonored me. The kind of dignity that says, even in uncertainty, I will not betray my future for temporary comfort. That is the path. That is the fire. That is how an unbreakable mind is forged. Not through ease, through chosen endurance, through internal command, through the quiet refusal to let a weaker version of yourself keep making decisions for your life. And if you are still here, then maybe this is your moment. Maybe this is the point where you stop negotiating. Maybe this is the point where you stop circling the same patterns. Maybe this is the point where you stop asking whether you can become stronger and start proving that you will. Because life will keep asking the same question until you answer it with action. Will you remain as you are? Or will you rise? That is the uncomfortable truth. And eventually, everyone must choose. The truth about pain is that most people do not fear pain itself nearly as much as they fear what pain reveals. Because pain has a way of stripping away illusion. It removes the mask. It exposes where you are weak, where you are attached, where you are dependent, where your identity is still built on fragile things. And that is why suffering feels so unbearable to the average person. Not simply because it hurts, but because it tells the truth. And truth is heavy. Truth does not flatter. Truth does not sedate. Truth does not protect your ego. Truth stands before you like a mirror and says, this is who you are when life stops being easy. And if you have never trained your inner world, that reflection can be terrifying. This is why the Stoics spoke so often about adversity. Not because they worshiped suffering, but because they understood something modern people keep forgetting. Hardship reveals the architecture of the soul. Epictetus said, circumstances don't make the man, they only reveal him to himself. And that is the uncomfortable truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Pain reveals you to yourself. Rejection reveals you to yourself. Loss reveals you to yourself. Delay reveals you to yourself. Humiliation reveals you to yourself. Loneliness reveals you to yourself. You do not truly know the strength of your mind when things are going well. You discover it when your plans collapse, when your heart is disappointed, when your ego is bruised. when the people you expected to stand beside you disappear, and when the future you imagined no longer looks the way you thought it would. That is when the performance ends. That is when your character begins to speak. And if we are honest, some of the strongest versions of ourselves were not born in comfort. They were born in pressure, born in heartbreak, born in silence, born in betrayal, born in seasons where nobody understood the battle happening inside your mind. That is why some pain is not your enemy. Some pain is your initiation. That may be one of the hardest truths to accept, especially if you are in the middle of a season that feels unfair. Because when you are hurting, your first instinct is to escape, to numb, to distract, to demand answers, to ask life why it chose you for this particular suffering. But the Stoics would ask a different question. Not why is this happening to me, but what is this asking me to become? That is a completely different posture. That is not helplessness. That is power. Because the moment you stop viewing pain only as punishment and start viewing it as training, your relationship with suffering changes forever. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Think about that carefully. What stands in the way becomes the way. The rejection becomes the lesson. The delay becomes the discipline. The loneliness becomes the mirror. The failure becomes the teacher. The pain becomes the forge. And suddenly, the thing you thought was there to destroy you becomes the very thing that teaches you how to build yourself correctly. That is Stoicism. Not pretending life is easy, but refusing to let difficulty be meaningless. And one of the most uncomfortable truths you will ever have to face is this: some of the pain in your life was necessary because the old version of you would never have changed voluntarily. That is hard to hear, but for many people, comfort was never going to awaken them. Success was never going to humble them. Pleasure was never going to mature them. Validation was never going to deepen them. Only loss did that. Only heartbreak did that. Only rejection did that. Only the collapse did that. Because some lessons are too deep to be learned in comfort. They must be carved into you by life itself. And while that may sound harsh, there is something strangely beautiful in it too. Because it means your suffering is not always random. It may be forming capacities within you that comfort never could. Patience, restraint, self-respect, emotional endurance, inner stillness, discernment, detachment. These are not soft qualities. These are weapons. Not weapons to harm others. Weapons to stop the world from constantly harming you. That is the difference. A person with no inner discipline is vulnerable to everything. Vulnerable to rejection. Vulnerable to temptation. Vulnerable to public opinion. Vulnerable to praise. Vulnerable to criticism. Vulnerable to loneliness. Vulnerable to delay. But a person who has suffered consciously, a person who has sat in the fire without allowing it to rot them from the inside, becomes different. Their mind hardens in the right places. Their spirit becomes less easily moved. Their standards become cleaner. Their dependence on external things begins to die. And that death is freedom. Because another uncomfortable truth is this: a lot of what you call pain is actually attachment being challenged. Let that sink in. A lot of what you call pain is actually attachment being challenged. Attachment to how you thought life should go. Attachment to who you thought would stay. Attachment to being understood. Attachment to being chosen. Attachment to getting results on your timeline. Attachment to control. Attachment to comfort. Attachment to your image. Attachment to your old identity. And when life begins tearing those attachments away, it feels like suffering. But often, what is really happening is purification. Life is showing you what you have been leaning on too heavily. This is why Stoicism places such a deep emphasis on detachment. Not because love is wrong. Not because ambition is wrong. Not because desire itself is evil. But because once your peace becomes dependent on anything outside your own character, you become fragile. And fragility is expensive. If your peace depends on people behaving the way you want, you will suffer. If your confidence depends on constant success, you will suffer. If your worth depends on being admired, you will suffer. If your identity depends on external stability, you will suffer. That is why the Stoics kept returning to the same principle over and over again. Control what you can. Release what you cannot. Simple, but brutal, because what you can control is not the world. It is yourself, your response, your discipline, your standards, your perception, your speech, your actions, your character. That is your territory. And many people suffer because they spend their lives trying to dominate what is not their territory while neglecting the one place where they actually have power. That is like abandoning your own kingdom to go fight imaginary wars. No wonder the mind becomes exhausted. No wonder peace feels impossible. You are trying to command the wind while your own inner house is in disorder. And that is why Stoicism begins within. Before you master outcomes, you must master reactions. Before you seek influence, you must seek self-command. Before you ask life to respect you, you must become someone your own conscience respects. That last part is important, because one of the most uncomfortable truths about rejection is that it often hurts less because of what was lost, and more because it wounds the ego. And the ego is fragile. The ego wants to be chosen. The ego wants to be praised. The ego wants to be admired. The ego wants to feel important. The ego wants to avoid humiliation at all costs. But if your life is ruled by ego, every rejection becomes unbearable because it feels like an attack on your existence itself. That is dangerous, because then you start making desperate decisions. You chase where you should walk away. You explain where you should remain silent. You prove where you should detach. You cling where you should release. You settle where you should stand tall. All because the ego cannot tolerate being denied. But the Stoic does not build identity on being chosen by the world. The Stoic builds identity on being aligned with virtue. That is a different foundation entirely, a stronger one, because if your foundation is virtue, then rejection cannot define you. Can sting, can wound, can disappoint, but it cannot reduce your worth. And that is the kind of strength you need if you want to survive this world without becoming bitter. Because bitterness is another danger pain creates. When people are hurt without wisdom, they often harden in the wrong way. They become cynical instead of discerning. They become cold instead of composed. They become defensive instead of disciplined. They become guarded instead of grounded. And from the outside, that can look like strength. But it is not. It is armor over an unhealed wound. Real strength is not becoming cruel because life was cruel to you. Real strength is remaining principled in a world that keeps giving you reasons not to be. That is much harder and much rarer. Seneca said, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Notice what he did not say. He did not say difficulties automatically strengthen the mind. He said they can. And that distinction matters. Because suffering does not automatically make people wise. Sometimes it just makes them wounded. Pain only becomes power when it is processed correctly. Otherwise, it becomes poison. That means your suffering is not enough on its own. Reflection is required. Honesty is required. Discipline is required. Silence is required. Meaning is required. You must sit with what life has shown you and ask yourself, what did this pain expose in me? What did it teach me about my attachments? What did it reveal about my standards? What version of me can no longer survive this lesson? Those are powerful questions. Questions that can rebuild a human being from the inside out. And if you are willing to ask them honestly, you may begin to realize that some of your greatest pain did not come to end you. It came to separate you from illusions you had outgrown. Illusions about love. Illusions about friendship. Illusions about timing. Illusions about fairness. Illusions about who you thought you needed to be in order to matter. That is why pain often feels like loss. Because it is the loss of illusion. And while that loss can feel brutal, it is also clarifying. Because once illusion dies, reality can finally teach you. Now you stop begging to be understood by people who lack depth. Now you stop expecting permanence from things designed to pass. Now you stop mistaking intensity for connection. Now you stop confusing attention for love. Now you stop handing your peace to outcomes you do not control. Now your mind begins to mature. Now your standards begin to rise. Now your soul begins to stand up straight. And this is where suffering, if used well, can make you dangerous. Not dangerous in the childish sense. Dangerous in the Stoic sense. Dangerous because your center can no longer be bought with praise. Dangerous because your peace can no longer be hijacked by rejection. Dangerous because your discipline no longer depends on your mood. Dangerous because your values remain intact even when life becomes difficult. Dangerous because you are no longer easy to manipulate through fear, approval, or emotional chaos. That is power. That is what pain can produce when it does not break you, but refines you. And refinement is painful. Gold is not refined in comfort. Steel is not forged in softness. Character is not built in ease. So why do you keep expecting your strongest self to emerge from a painless life? That expectation itself is part of the illusion. The strongest version of you is likely waiting on the other side of what you have been avoiding. The conversation you do not want to have. The truth you do not want to admit. The discipline you do not want to commit to. The attachment you do not want to release. The standard you do not want to enforce. The identity you do not want to outgrow. That is where your next life begins. And yes, it will hurt, but not all pain is a warning. Some pain is a doorway, and if you can learn to tell the difference, you will stop running every time life asks you to evolve. That is the uncomfortable truth. The very suffering you are praying to escape may be the furnace that finally makes you unshakable. So if this message spoke to something deep inside you, if this video didn't just entertain you, but confronted you, then don't let it end here. Let this be the moment you stop running from the truth and start becoming the person your pain has been trying to create. And if you made it this far, I want you to do one thing right now. Go down to the comment section and type, "I choose discipline, not for me, for you." Let that be your declaration. Let that be your line in the sand. Let that be the moment you stop negotiating with the weaker version of yourself. And if you want more content like this, content that sharpens your mind, strengthens your discipline, and helps you build a truly unbreakable mindset, then make sure you subscribe to Unbreakable Mind, turn on the notification bell, and stay close. Because the next video on your screen may be the one that changes the way you see your life forever. Until next time, stay disciplined, stay dangerous, stay unshaken, and above all, protect your mind.